So you heard it from both sides there. Coming off the stage, we see it's covered a whole variety of topics there, starting from everything from Syria to, most importantly, probably on the Trump agenda, the idea of whether or not everyone is paying their fair share in the NATO alliance. And he even mentioned, threw in there, that they were going to be looking backwards at clawbacks at people who didn't pay in the past, which was an interesting point for our business audience as you watch that, David.
I love that.
You like that, right? You both laughed when
Bureaucratic
that
clawback.
happened. Yeah, so
Here
true.
now to react to all this is Michael Waltz. He's former senior advisor under Vice President Cheney, retired Green Beret commander. He's also a Fox News contributor. Michael, first on the question of retooling NATO, there are really essentially three ways that Donald Trump wants to retool it. As Melissa mentioned, the cost. That's a very important thing to all of us taxpayers. Also, the mission itself. It was set up, of course, against when the Soviet Union was alive and threatening the world. Soviet Union is no longer exists. Russia's a problem, but at least it doesn't have Eastern Europe anymore. And its structure itself. Let's first talk about its mission. How easy or difficult will it be to retool it to focus on our current biggest threat, which I think is terrorism?
Well, you're right in asking that question. Thank you, because it is an incredibly difficult thing for NATO to do, and I think it's going to take quite a long time. You raised the point in terms of what was NATO, originally set about and what was it created to do. Well, it was created to defend Western Europe against a Soviet invasion in the early 50s up until the end of the Cold War. We saw a real test of NATO in terms of how it shifted in its military capabilities when it moved into Afghanistan. And I think I was on the ground with a lot of these allied forces, from the French, the Italians, to the British, and they really struggled, frankly, to project their power, going from a home defense force to being expeditionary overseas in one of the most difficult parts of the world, whether it was parts, supplies, armored protection. It has a long way to go. It struggled then in Afghanistan, and I think they're going to have to invest in getting outside of Europe's borders in order for it to be expeditionary now.
Let's talk about the bureaucracy of NATO, because like any international bureaucracy, it's just thick with bureaucrats that usually muck things up rather than speeding things along. Is it possible at all? I know we've tried with the United Nations for decades to try to make it more efficient. It's just become less efficient, more of a waste and fraud institution. How much of that infects NATO, and how do we get rid of it, if it's possible?
Well, it's fundamental to the structure of NATO to be a consensus organization, meaning all of the members have to agree. One of the things, again, we struggled with in Iraq and Afghanistan was just getting all of the members to agree on how they approach counterinsurgency from a doctrine standpoint. Then they've also struggled with what we called national caveats, meaning, the Germans could do one thing, but the French could do another thing, and the Italians couldn't do either of those things. So it made a unity of command and unity of effort on the ground incredibly difficult. That said, from a diplomatic standpoint, operating alongside allies, so it's not just the United States alone, is incredibly important. I don't mean to take away from the sacrifices of the Canadians, the British, and others, and what they did on the ground. I just think we have a long way to go from a strategic alliance to actually being an operational alliance in these types of fights against terrorists.
Right. And Michael, Russia's not out of the picture, and unfortunately Russia is now an obstacle insofar as it's allied with a terrorist state, Iran, a terrorist institution, Hezbollah, and a murderous dictator, Assad. Is it going to be possible to somehow flip it around? Maybe are they going to try to actually somehow incorporate Russia into NATO? Because when I heard the foreign minister today just lying through his teeth, saying that even though the Russians were at that air base from which the gas attacks apparently took place, he said, oh, we didn't see 100% assurance that it didn't happen. I mean, it's still in the business of selling lies, just like it was when it was the Soviet Union.
Well, in terms of incorporating Russia into NATO, I don't think so. I don't think we'll see that anytime soon. And you've seen kind of a bifurcation. You've seen the older traditional allies, the Western Europeans, less concern over the last few years, and the Eastern Europeans, the ones who used to be under Russia, the Soviet Union's thumb, in Romania and Poland and the Baltics, incredibly worried, and that's where you're starting to see U.S. deployments now to reassure those newer Eastern European allies who know what it means to be under the Russian bear.
Michael,
and now we're bringing those together.
Just have to, before we go, apparently John Kerry and Susan Rice bought the lies of the Russians that they didn't know, that they had thought that the Syrians gave up all their gas weapons entirely. Did you ever believe that very quickly?
I don't think anybody believed that.
Right.
Well,
I don't think anybody.
John Kerry did and Susan Rice did.
Well, I think they believed what they wanted to hear, which was to avoid intervention at any cost, and essentially fed into their preconceived notion of taking any military option off the table. But inaction has consequences, and they've had devastating consequences in Syria.
People died as a result. Michael Waltz, thank you very much. Melissa.